As a 34-year-old lead software architect in Seattle, Clara pushed open her parents' living room door expecting a birthday celebration, only to freeze as her father slammed a property transfer deed onto the coffee table. The thud shattered the quiet atmosphere. Her mother stood by the window with her arms crossed, refusing eye contact. Her younger brother, the undeniable golden child, sat on the sofa with an entitled smirk. There were no balloons, no presents, and no cake. There was only a cheap pen demanding her immediate signature. Clara stared at the legal documents, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. It was a detailed lien agreement targeting her luxury condominium, accompanied by a transfer of title for her brand-new electric vehicle. She had proudly paid for both assets with her own money after years of relentless grinding in the tech industry. "The decision has already been made," her father announced with a cold, terrifyingly authoritative tone. He did not ask for a favor. He delivered an absolute command. He ruthlessly explained that her brother was drowning in massive financial debt due to reckless sports gambling and catastrophic business investments. Their brilliant family solution was not to hold the grown man accountable. Instead, they planned to forcibly liquidate Clara's assets to blindly bail him out. The sheer audacity left Clara paralyzed. The very parents who had never financially supported her ambitions were now aggressively attempting to strip her of her independent net worth. The profound betrayal intensified as her father casually revealed a horrific truth they had hidden for over 10 years. He admitted, without displaying a single ounce of parental shame, that the generous college trust fund her grandparents had specifically set up for her academic future had been completely emptied long ago. They had secretly forged her signature, draining every single penny of her rightful inheritance to purchase her brother his first expensive starter home. It was the very same house he had just carelessly lost to bank foreclosure weeks prior. They had knowingly forced Clara to take out crushing student loans, silently watching her cry from overwhelming financial stress, all while secretly funding her brother's luxurious lifestyle with her own stolen money. The sickening realization washed over Clara. They had intentionally let her believe she was a heavy financial burden, keeping her desperate for their approval, all while living on the generational wealth that was legally hers. Her father aggressively stepped closer, intentionally using his physical frame to silently intimidate her into submission. He commanded her not to ever use that disrespectful tone, firmly insisting they made a necessary financial decision for the greater good of the family. He arrogantly pointed out that she made hundreds of thousands of dollars now, brutally dismissing her right to own an expensive car or a secure apartment. He violently pushed the pen closer to her hand, expecting unquestioning compliance. Her brother leaned forward, playing the helpless victim perfectly. He whined loudly that it was just material money, falsely promising to pay her back eventually, though everyone knew that was a blatant lie. He maliciously accused her of being incredibly selfish for even hesitating while his life was allegedly falling apart. He was loudly demanding a massive financial bailout, fully supported by their horribly enabling parents. Clara took a deep breath, physically feeling a monumental shift in her own psychology. The heavy chains of lifelong familial guilt simply snapped. She looked down at the pen, then slowly looked up at the three toxic people who had never truly loved her. She physically stepped backward, completely refusing to touch the predatory legal documents. "No," she stated firmly, the single, powerful word of absolute defiance hung heavily in the tense air, thick and remarkably absolute. Ignoring their desperate theatrical displays, Clara firmly announced she was leaving the property and quickly turned toward the front door. But her furious father was significantly faster. He aggressively moved his body to block her only exit, his large frame casting a dark shadow. He dropped his voice to a dangerous, violent growl, directly threatening that she was absolutely not walking out of this house until she signed away her valuable property. "You used my college fund for him," Clara repeated, the boiling, righteous anger finally replacing the initial shock. "You let me drown in student loans while you bought him a house." Her father did not even blink at the completely accurate accusation. "He needed a head start, Clara," he justified coldly and without remorse. "You were always smart enough to figure things out on your own." The blatant, unapologetic favoritism was physically sickening. Her mother quickly stepped up beside her husband, wildly threatening that if Clara did not sign the paper immediately, she would absolutely no longer be considered a part of their family. Clara stared directly into her mother's cold eyes, feeling freezing ice flooding her veins. That is the best birthday gift you could have ever given me," she replied with brutal honesty. She immediately pulled out her smartphone, clearly illuminating the bright screen to show the emergency dialer ready to connect to the local police department. The power dynamic instantly changed. She gave her father a terrifyingly calm ultimatum. If he did not step away from the front door in the next 3 seconds, she was immediately calling the authorities to officially report an unlawful detainment. She also loudly promised to file a formal felony police report regarding the grand theft and illegal forgery of her inheritance trust fund. The sudden threat of real legal consequences finally broke his arrogant facade. He hesitated, pure panic briefly flashing in his eyes before he slowly stepped aside in complete defeat. Clara did not look back even once as she confidently walked out of the toxic house and into the cool evening air. She unlocked her vehicle and got in, her hands shaking slightly from pure adrenaline. The complete silence inside the premium cabin was deafening, but it tasted exactly like absolute freedom. As she rapidly pulled out of the dark driveway, her phone began to buzz frantically with demanding, panicked messages from her brother. They foolishly thought she was just throwing a temporary emotional tantrum. They genuinely believed she would eventually calm down, cave to the immense pressure, and bring them the massive amount of money. They had absolutely no idea that Clara was already drafting a devastating email to the most ruthless financial litigation attorney in the entire city. The heavy glass doors of the elite Seattle law firm closed behind Clara, instantly muting the chaotic city traffic. She sat ramrod straight in a luxurious leather chair, sliding a thick, meticulously organized folder of banking records across the polished mahogany desk. Marcus Vance, a senior litigation partner universally feared throughout the corporate financial district, adjusted his expensive glasses and opened the file. His sharp eyes rapidly scanned the highlighted bank transfers, the forged signature documents, and the original trust fund charter her grandparents had explicitly established over 10 years ago. He did not offer any warm, comforting platitudes or gentle reassurance. He operated strictly on cold, hard facts, and the undisputed facts laid out before him constituted a massive, undeniable string of felonies. For over a decade, her trusted parents had systematically drained her legally protected inheritance, silently funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars to subsidize her younger brother's reckless and extravagant lifestyle. They had knowingly committed egregious wire fraud, crossed state lines with stolen institutional funds, and blatantly forged a primary beneficiary signature on multiple binding federal documents. Vance leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together with a predatory, calculating stillness. "This is not a simple family dispute," he stated with absolute professional certainty. He explained that they were looking at severe financial crimes, charges carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences if aggressively pursued through the federal criminal court system. The sheer, breathtaking scale of the financial betrayal shocked even a seasoned lawyer who handled incredibly ugly corporate divorces on a daily basis. He laid out a devastatingly aggressive legal strategy. They would immediately file a massive civil suit for grand theft, malicious fraud, and a fundamental breach of fiduciary duty. More importantly, they would file an emergency judicial injunction to completely freeze her parents' comfortable retirement accounts and place a heavy lien on their primary suburban residence as immediate collateral. Because the golden child brother had already squandered the stolen money and carelessly lost his newly purchased house to bank foreclosure, the enabling parents were the only entities left with fully recoverable assets. Vance looked directly at Clara, solemnly warning her that initiating this brutal legal process would permanently destroy whatever fragile relationship she had left with her entire bloodline. There would be absolutely no peaceful holiday dinners, no tearful family reconciliations, and absolutely no turning back once the official process server delivered the terrifying papers. Clara thought about the crushing, suffocating weight of the high-interest student loan she had stubbornly paid off through years of grueling corporate overtime. She vividly remembered the arrogant, entitled smirk on her brother's face as he sat on the sofa just last night, loudly demanding her newly purchased electric vehicle to instantly cover his shady gambling debts. She recalled her father physically blocking the front door, violently attempting to intimidate her into signing away her hard-earned condominium. The lingering, invisible chains of guilt that had tied her to their toxic expectations simply evaporated, rapidly replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve. She picked up the heavy, expensive fountain pen Vance offered her and signed the binding legal retainer agreement without a single tremor in her hand. Burn their financial safety net to the ground, Clara ordered smoothly. Her steady voice completely devoid of any remaining familial affection or hesitation. While Vance immediately mobilized his elite team of ruthless forensic accountants, the toxic family machine was already spinning a desperately aggressive counter-narrative. By the time Clara safely returned to her secure high-rise apartment, her smartphone was aggressively vibrating with endless, frantic notifications. Her mother had taken the massive public offensive, intentionally posting a long, dramatically weeping narrative on all her social media pages. The highly manipulated public post painted a completely tragic picture of a loving, traditional family in sudden crisis, unexpectedly devastated by a terrible financial hardship. She maliciously painted Clara as an incredibly greedy, heartless daughter who had abruptly abandoned her desperate younger brother in his darkest hour just to selfishly protect her own luxurious lifestyle. The public smear campaign was incredibly calculated, specifically designed to unleash a blinding swarm of angry flying monkeys upon Clara. Outraged aunts, judgmental uncles, and distant cousins who had never once bothered to check on her during her violently struggling college years were suddenly leaving furious, incredibly abusive voicemails. They blindly repeated her mother's fabricated lies, loudly accusing Clara of supreme arrogance and aggressively demanding she immediately return home to surrender her money to save the family honor. It was a classic, desperate tactic of coordinated emotional terrorism, banking on the hope that overwhelming social shame would force Clara to quietly submit to their outrageous demands. But Clara simply muted her device, refusing to feed their dramatic, hungry chaos with any emotional response. Realizing the intense online harassment was utterly failing to break her spirit, her brother foolishly decided to escalate the conflict to a dangerous, potentially criminal new level. Early the following morning, he actually bypassed the ground-floor security desk of her towering downtown Seattle office building. He aggressively marched right into the main corporate lobby, violently demanding to speak directly with her tech company's senior human resources director. When the trained security guards quickly intercepted him, he began loudly screaming completely fabricated accusations, maliciously attempting to publicly humiliate her in front of her prestigious professional peers. "She is having a severe mental breakdown," he yelled wildly, falsely claiming she was heavily medicated and legally incompetent to manage her own financial affairs. His incredibly malicious goal was crystal clear to everyone watching the pathetic scene. If he could not violently bully her into freely giving him her money, he was going to try and completely destroy the lucrative career that allowed her to independently earn it. He desperately wanted her publicly fired, totally ruined, and forced to crawl back to their manipulative parents for basic daily survival. Fortunately, Clara was a highly respected lead software architect, not a fragile, easily intimidated junior employee. The building's security promptly and physically escorted the screaming, unhinged man out onto the rainy city pavement, permanently banning him from the massive commercial premises under threat of immediate arrest. The brothers' foolish public outburst proved to be a massive, catastrophic tactical error. Clara immediately emailed the high-definition lobby security footage directly to her legal team, providing Vance with perfectly documented, undeniable evidence of targeted harassment and attempted professional sabotage. It was the exact final nail legally needed to rapidly expedite the emergency court filings. That very afternoon, the family's completely false reality finally violently collided with the actual, devastating legal consequences of their horrific actions. Her parents were confidently hosting a large, expensive catered brunch at their suburban home, gathering all the extended relatives to further spread their toxic victim narrative and gather more emotional sympathy. Right in the absolute middle of her father's highly theatrical, tearful speech about the paramount importance of family loyalty, a professional legal process server confidently walked right up the crowded driveway. He completely bypassed the confused, whispering relatives, walked directly up to her utterly shocked parents and aggressively handed them a massive, heavy stack of official federal court documents. The cheerful, gossiping party atmosphere instantly died a brutal death as her father slowly read the terrifying, legally binding cover letter. Vance sent a brief, brutally efficient text message to Clara's secure phone. "We are officially freezing their retirement accounts." Clara read the powerful words while quietly sipping her premium coffee, looking out over the beautiful city skyline. The financial siege had successfully begun. But just as she set her phone down, A completely unknown local number bypassed her silent filters, ringing with an ominous, continuous urgency. Clara stared at the vibrating screen, watching the unknown local number pulse with relentless urgency. She finally slid her thumb across the smooth glass, fully expecting to hear the aggressive demands of another manipulated relative. Instead, the heavy silence was instantly broken by the hysterical, hyperventilating sobs of her eldest aunt. This was the exact same woman who had viciously cursed her out on a malicious voicemail just 3 hours prior, loudly demanding she surrender her hard-earned wealth to save the fragile family honor. Now, that blinding, arrogant hostility was completely gone, rapidly replaced by a tone of absolute, suffocating financial terror. The panicked woman practically choked on her own tears as she rapidly confessed a shocking, catastrophic secret the parents had desperately tried to hide. The lavish brunch was never about celebrating family loyalty. It was a desperate, coordinated presentation designed to squeeze emergency cash from the extended relatives. Worse, the aunt revealed that for the past 2 years, the parents had quietly convinced multiple family members to empty their personal retirement savings accounts to fund the Golden Child brothers' imaginary, constantly failing business ventures. The parents had confidently secured these massive family loans by explicitly promising that Clara's lucrative software architect salary was the ultimate, legally binding financial safety net that would never fail. The manipulative parents had maliciously lied to the entire extended family, falsely claiming Clara was a silent, incredibly wealthy partner in the brothers' failing enterprise. They had confidently assured the relatives that even if the business temporarily stumbled, Clara's massive corporate income would easily cover all the high-interest repayments. Now that Marcus Vance had successfully secured a brutal federal injunction, freezing the parents' retirement accounts and placing a massive lien on their suburban estate, the extended family suddenly realized their life savings were permanently trapped inside a collapsing house of cards. The furious flying monkeys had instantly transformed into desperate victims of a massive familial Ponzi scheme. The weeping aunt violently demanded that Clara immediately call her ruthless litigation attorney and lift the devastating financial freeze. She selfishly argued that Clara had no right to punish the innocent extended family for the aging parents' terrible mistakes. Clara sat perfectly still, letting the pure, unfiltered audacity of the demand wash over her. These were the exact same people who had blindly enabled her parents' toxic favoritism for decades, silently watching her struggle with crippling, high-interest student debt while constantly praising her brother's stolen luxury. They had aggressively participated in the vicious public smear campaign against her just this morning, fully willing to see her professionally ruined. Clara did not offer a single ounce of comforting sympathy. She spoke with a calm, freezing precision that cut straight through the aunt's hysterical weeping. She clearly explained that she had never signed a single document guaranteeing those fraudulent loans, strictly advising the desperate woman to immediately hire her own aggressive litigation attorney. "Your money is gone, and they are the ones who stole it," Clara stated with absolute, brutal finality, offering zero emotional comfort. She firmly ended the call and permanently blocked the number, completely refusing to absorb the heavy consequences of their collective, enabling greed. The massive financial trap had violently snapped shut, leaving her parents completely isolated and rapidly drowning in a tidal wave of furious relatives demanding immediate repayment. But the sudden, catastrophic destruction of the parents' financial shield left the Golden Child brother entirely exposed to the dangerous reality of his own actions. Without his mother and father constantly writing massive checks to cover his catastrophic gambling losses, his deeply shady creditors were finally closing in. He was entirely cut off, absolutely desperate, and rapidly running out of time before severe, violent consequences caught up with his entitled arrogance. Later that dark evening, Clara was quietly reviewing highly complex encrypted software code on her monitors when her smartphone suddenly flashed a bright red proximity alert. The advanced security application linked directly to her brand-new electric vehicle had detected unauthorized, lingering movement in the private, subterranean parking garage of her secure residential building. She swiftly pulled up the live, high-definition camera feed on her large desktop monitor. The stark night vision footage clearly revealed her brother, wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt, nervously pacing around her expensive luxury car. He was aggressively pulling on the heavy metal door handles, his frantic movements indicating a man pushed to the absolute edge of severe panic. Clara watched with cold, analytical detachment as he pulled a heavy steel crowbar from his jacket, clearly intending to shatter the reinforced glass and manually bypass the electronic ignition to pay off his looming, potentially violent debts. He genuinely believed she was safely asleep in her high-rise tower, completely unaware of his malicious felony-level vandalism. He foolishly thought he could simply steal her valuable property and vanish into the dark city night without facing any serious legal repercussions. Clara did not scream, panic, or rush down to confront the dangerous, unhinged man. Instead, she smoothly tapped a single button on her keyboard, immediately connecting to the building's armed 24-hour security desk while simultaneously dialing the local police emergency line. "He is armed and actively attempting to steal my vehicle," she informed the emergency dispatcher with chilling calm. She clearly reported his exact location within the highly secure residential facility, identifying the perpetrator on the live video feed. She sat back in her comfortable ergonomic chair, peacefully sipping her warm herbal tea as she watched the inevitable, catastrophic consequences unfold. Within 3 short minutes, the heavy steel doors of the underground garage violently burst open. Multiple armed security guards and 2 uniformed police officers rapidly swarmed the confined space, aggressively shouting loud, authoritative commands. The brother dropped the heavy steel crowbar in absolute terror, wildly raising his trembling hands as they firmly slammed him against the cold concrete wall and tightly secured heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. He began desperately screaming at the security cameras, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Tell them to let me go. It is just a misunderstanding," he pleaded pathetically. But Clara simply closed the video application, letting the police drag him away to a dark, miserable holding cell. The harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the downtown Seattle police precinct buzzed with a low, incredibly annoying hum that perfectly matched the massive headache threatening to form behind Clara's eyes. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. She sat perfectly straight in a cold, unforgiving metal chair located deep inside the sterile robbery division, calmly sipping bitter black coffee from a cheap paper cup. Just outside the heavy glass partition of the primary interrogation room, her parents were furiously arguing with a deeply unbothered booking officer. They were aggressively demanding immediate, unrestricted access to their precious golden child, completely ignoring the standard legal protocols. They had rushed to the downtown station in the middle of the freezing night, driving recklessly through the empty city streets, solely focused on saving the brother from the terrifying reality of a state penitentiary. A weary, heavily lined senior detective walked into the small room, holding a thick manila folder completely stuffed with freshly printed documentation. He exhausted, sighed, sliding several high-definition, full-color photographs of the subterranean parking garage directly across the scratched metal table. The crystal-clear security images clearly showed the younger brother aggressively wielding a heavy steel crowbar, his face twisted in desperate panic as he explicitly tried to violently shatter the reinforced glass of her expensive electric vehicle. The detective looked up, his expression completely neutral and strictly professional. He politely asked if Clara was absolutely certain she wanted to formally pursue severe felony grand theft and armed vandalism charges against her own flesh and blood. He solemnly warned her that a formal criminal conviction of this massive magnitude would permanently destroy his future corporate employment prospects and absolutely guarantee a lengthy, mandatory prison sentence in a maximum security facility. Before Clara could even formulate a verbal response to the tired officer, the heavy wooden door violently burst open. Her mother aggressively pushed her way into the restricted interrogation room, completely bypassing the shouting desk sergeant who tried to physically block her path. She slammed her trembling hands down onto the metal table, her face red with pure, unfiltered rage and desperate, weeping exhaustion. She fiercely commanded Clara to immediately drop the ridiculous criminal charges, wildly claiming that the brother was just heavily intoxicated, deeply confused, and merely playing a harmless, stupid family prank. The desperate mother blatantly lied directly to the seasoned police detective, falsely asserting that Clara had explicitly given the brother prior verbal permission to borrow the luxury vehicle for the entire holiday weekend. She attempted to paint the massive felony arrest as a gigantic, hilarious misunderstanding that should be quietly swept under the rug to protect the fragile family honor. Clara did not flinch, completely refusing to break her steady, unwavering eye contact with the stunned law enforcement officer. She clearly and firmly stated that she had never given him any permission whatsoever, actively confirming that the violent man in the security video was aggressively attempting to steal her private property to illegally pay off massive, shady gambling debts. The mother shrieked in absolute, piercing horror, finally realizing her blatant, pathetic lies were completely failing to successfully manipulate the highly experienced detective. She dramatically collapsed to her knees on the dirty linoleum floor, instantly switching her tactics from aggressive, shouting bullying to pathetic, theatrical begging. She loudly wept that a brutal prison sentence would completely and permanently ruin his incredibly delicate mental health, violently pleading for sisterly mercy. The father aggressively pushed his way into the crowded, tense room next, his usual arrogant, commanding swagger completely replaced by genuine, sweating, undeniable panic. He desperately offered Clara a massive, completely hollow financial bribe right in front of the strictly observing police officer. He loudly promised to officially transfer the entire legal deed of their large, expensive suburban home directly into her name if she simply told the police it was a minor, insignificant family misunderstanding. He arrogantly assumed that her righteous, burning anger could easily be bought off with a piece of heavily mortgaged real estate, totally failing to realize the massive, irreversible shift in their established power dynamic. Clara looked down at her desperately kneeling, sobbing mother and her sweating, hyperventilating father with profound, freezing, absolute disgust. Justice is not a financial transaction, and my forgiveness is absolutely not for sale, she stated with brutal, uncompromising clarity. She slowly turned her attention back to the highly attentive detective, officially confirming on the permanent record that she wanted to aggressively press the maximum criminal charges legally possible under state law. She smoothly picked up the provided pen and firmly signed the formal, legally binding witness statement, permanently locking her brother into the unforgiving criminal justice system without a single ounce of hesitation. The father instantly exploded in violent, completely uncontrollable fury, aggressively lunging toward Clara with his heavy fists clenched tightly at his sides. Two large, heavily muscled uniformed police officers immediately intercepted his reckless advance, violently pinning him hard against the cold concrete wall and loudly threatening to arrest him for physically assaulting a protected victim inside a police station. The mother wailed loudly, aggressively cursing Clara as a heartless, completely evil monster who was intentionally destroying their beautiful, loving family out of pure, petty, unjustified jealousy. Clara simply stood up, smoothly brushing the invisible wrinkles from her expensive designer coat, entirely and beautifully unaffected by their pathetic, screaming emotional tantrums. She calmly walked out of the loud, chaotic precinct, permanently leaving her incredibly toxic parents completely trapped in the humiliating, public disaster they had personally and painstakingly created over decades of enabling abuse. They had spent their entire adult lives aggressively shielding the entitled golden child from facing even the most minor, insignificant consequences, and now they were utterly, devastatingly powerless to protect him from a massive, life-altering felony conviction. The brother would finally face the harsh, unforgiving reality of a small concrete cell completely and permanently stripped of his enabling financial safety net and his entirely unearned familial privilege. As Clara stepped out into the bright, crisp morning air of the bustling, waking city, she felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute, undeniable liberation. But the devastating, far-reaching consequences of her parents' massive financial fraud were far from completely resolved. Just as she smoothly unlocked her secure luxury car, her encrypted smartphone loudly chimed with an urgent, high-priority email notification from Marcus Vance, her ruthless litigation attorney. The elite forensic accounting team had successfully breached the parents' hidden financial records, discovering a massive, highly illegal offshore bank account directly tied to her stolen college trust fund, officially upgrading their crimes to federal money laundering. Clara sat in the quiet, secure cabin of her electric vehicle, the bright screen of her smartphone illuminating her calm face. She meticulously read the highly encrypted email from Marcus Vance, her ruthless litigation attorney. The ominous words regarding federal money laundering and illegal offshore shell companies glared back at her in bold text. This was no longer just a bitter domestic dispute over a stolen college inheritance. Her toxic parents had aggressively weaponized her stolen identity on a massive, international financial scale. She immediately put the car in gear and drove straight back to the imposing downtown law firm. The early morning sun was just beginning to reflect off the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district. Vance was already waiting for her in his spacious corner office, looking remarkably energized despite the early hour. He aggressively spread a massive, highly detailed schematic of international banking flowcharts across his polished mahogany desk, explicitly detailing the breathtaking scope of the familial betrayal. The elite forensic accountants had meticulously traced the stolen trust fund money through a complex web of deceit. The parents had not simply handed the stolen cash directly to the golden child. They had actively created entirely fraudulent corporate entities using Clara's stolen social security number, intentionally routing the funds through shady Caribbean banks. They systematically executed this elaborate scheme to hide the massive theft from the Internal Revenue Service and illegally avoid paying heavy capital gains taxes. Vance explained the terrifying gravity of the newly discovered situation with cold, surgical precision. By officially attaching Clara's spotless name to these highly illicit offshore accounts, her parents had dangerously exposed her to severe federal tax evasion charges. They had maliciously used her prestigious professional reputation as a lead software architect as a protective, legitimate human shield for their deeply illegal, catastrophic financial gymnastics. He smoothly slid a heavy official federal cooperation agreement across the polished desk. Signing the binding legal document would immediately grant Clara absolute legal immunity from the massive tax fraud, but it would simultaneously trigger a massive, unstoppable federal criminal investigation directly targeting her parents. There would be absolutely no quiet civil settlements, no tearful family apologies, and no turning back from decades of mandatory federal prison time. Vance solemnly warned her that society often judged successful children incredibly harshly for willingly sending their elderly parents to a harsh federal penitentiary. The remaining extended relatives would absolutely call her a ruthless, unforgiving monster for destroying the family patriarch. They made their choice the moment they used my name to hide their crimes, Clara stated with icy, unwavering finality. She grabbed the heavy fountain pen and signed the federal affidavit with a bold, aggressive stroke. By noon, the massive, crushing wheels of federal justice were already violently turning. The elite financial crimes division of the federal government does not move slowly when millions of dollars of fraudulent offshore transfers are officially verified. A coordinated fleet of dark government vehicles quietly but aggressively surrounded the parents' expensive, heavily mortgaged suburban estate, completely cutting off all possible avenues of physical escape. The exhausted, sweating parents had just returned home from the chaotic local police precinct, desperately trying to figure out how to illegally bail their golden child out of his severe grand theft auto charges. Before they could even sit down, their massive, heavy oak front door was violently pounded with terrifying, absolute law enforcement authority. The booming voices outside loudly demanded immediate entry into the private residence. Heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical vests rapidly flooded the lavish foyer. They loudly presented a sweeping, highly restrictive federal search warrant, completely ignoring the mother's hysterical, piercing screams of sheer terror. The arrogant father attempted to aggressively block the stern agents from entering his private home office, stubbornly relying on his usual, pathetic physical bullying tactics that had always worked on his daughter. A heavily muscled senior federal agent simply grabbed the father by his expensive collared shirt, effortlessly shoving the older man out of the way while loudly threatening him with immediate, violent arrest for actively obstructing a federal raid. The disciplined agents systematically began tearing the luxurious house apart, ruthlessly seizing all electronic devices, hidden paper ledgers, and locked metal filing cabinets containing their darkest secrets. The mother dramatically collapsed onto the expensive living room sofa, watching in absolute paralyzed horror as government officials carried out heavy boxes of deeply incriminating evidence. They were aggressively seizing the very computers used to illegally forge Clara's signature and manage the massive, crumbling offshore Ponzi scheme. Their entire fabricated life of suburban superiority was being violently dismantled piece by piece right in front of the gossiping neighbors. Clara watched the live news helicopter footage of the dramatic federal raid broadcasting on the large flat television screen mounted in Vance's corner office. The sensational local news anchors were already breathlessly reporting on the shocking, sudden downfall of the prominent suburban family. She felt a deep, profound sense of absolute satisfaction watching her previously arrogant father being firmly escorted out of his home in heavy steel handcuffs. The sheer public humiliation was absolute, devastating, and entirely irreversible. The parents had spent their entire adult lives desperately obsessing over their pristine social image, constantly demanding Clara sacrifice her own happiness and financial security to maintain their fake, wealthy facade. Now, their massive, unforgivable crimes were being aggressively broadcast to the entire city. permanently destroying their carefully curated legacy. The massive financial and legal siege was finally complete, effectively neutralizing her toxic bloodline forever. But the dangerous criminal underworld operates on an entirely different, highly unpredictable timeline than the slow federal justice system. Just as Vance triumphantly closed his expensive leather briefcase, his private secure office phone rang with an incredibly urgent, panicked call from the building's head of corporate security. The breathless security director rapidly reported that 3 massive, incredibly dangerous men covered in dark gang tattoos had just violently bypassed the main lobby security perimeter downstairs. They were absolutely not angry relatives or local police officers. They were the Golden Child brothers' violent, underground gambling creditors, and they had explicitly come looking for the wealthy sister to forcefully collect his massive, unpaid debts. The terrified voice of the senior security director violently crackled through the secure speakerphone sitting on the polished mahogany desk. He breathlessly reported that the heavily armed intruders had violently shoved past the marble reception desk in the ground floor lobby, completely ignoring the massive building security protocols. They had forcefully boarded the private executive elevator and were rapidly ascending directly toward their specific floor. Marcus Vance, a seasoned corporate attorney who rarely displayed genuine fear, immediately moved to physically engage the heavy steel deadbolts securing his corner office. He urgently instructed Clara to retreat into his reinforced private conference room and quietly wait for the armed city police to inevitably arrive. Clara did not move a single inch. She sat perfectly still in the luxurious leather chair, her expression completely devoid of any rising panic. She calmly instructed Vance to leave the heavy wooden doors completely unlocked, explicitly refusing to cower in a dark room like a frightened, helpless victim. She had spent her entire morning ruthlessly dismantling her toxic parents through aggressive federal legislation, and she was absolutely not going to let her pathetic brother's criminal mistakes force her into hiding. She smoothly opened her expensive laptop, her fingers flying across the illuminated keyboard with the practiced, rapid precision of a highly skilled software architect. Within seconds, the heavy glass doors of the elite law firm were violently kicked open, shattering the quiet, prestigious atmosphere of the outer reception area. Heavy, aggressive footsteps echoed loudly against the expensive hardwood floors as the 3 massive, heavily tattooed enforcers aggressively marched straight into Vance's private corner office. The ruthless leader of the criminal group wore a dark leather jacket and possessed a face covered in thick, violent scar tissue. He did not bother offering a polite introduction, instantly slamming a heavy, calloused hand down onto the expensive desk. He aggressively demanded a massive, 6-figure cash payment to completely clear the younger brother's catastrophic underground gambling debts. He arrogantly assumed Clara was just another soft, easily intimidated corporate professional who would quickly write a massive, blank check just to avoid any physical confrontation. He violently leaned over the desk, intentionally invading her personal space, and loudly threatened to permanently disfigure her face if she did not immediately transfer the demanded funds. He foolishly believed that terror and brute physical force were the ultimate, undeniable powers in the room. Vance stood perfectly straight beside his desk, silently sliding his hand toward a hidden emergency panic button, but Clara subtly raised a single finger to halt his protective action. She looked directly up into the violent gang leader's angry eyes, completely unfazed by his aggressive, intimidating posturing. She smoothly turned her laptop screen around, clearly displaying a highly complex, rapidly updating digital spreadsheet filled with encrypted banking transfers. "You are currently standing in the private office of a cooperating federal witness," Clara stated with a cold, terrifyingly calm precision. She explicitly explained that the massive building was currently under active, heavy surveillance by elite federal law enforcement agents due to the massive offshore money laundering investigation directly involving her toxic family. The violent leader hesitated for a brief fraction of a second, his arrogant facade slightly cracking as the heavy implications of her undeniable statement began to register. Clara ruthlessly pressed her massive tactical advantage, refusing to give him a single moment to recover his aggressive momentum. She clearly informed the dangerous men that her idiotic younger brother had completely funded his lavish lifestyle and his reckless underground gambling addiction using highly illegal, stolen offshore funds. She explicitly clarified that the federal government was already actively tracking every single penny of that stolen money, including the massive debts he owed to their illegal syndicate. Vance immediately recognized Clara's brilliant, ruthless strategy and smoothly stepped in to deliver the devastating legal blow. He calmly opened a fresh manila folder and slid a copy of a highly redacted federal search warrant across the polished desk. He coldly explained that the younger brother had maintained detailed, highly explicit digital ledgers of his illegal sports bets, foolishly attempting to keep an accurate record of his catastrophic losses. Vance confidently asserted that the elite forensic accountants had already discovered those hidden digital files, meaning the federal government now possessed the exact names, locations, and financial records of their entirely illegal underground operation. Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping to a dangerous, uncompromising whisper that completely commanded the tense room. She explicitly informed the shocked gang leader that her brother was currently sitting in a downtown police interrogation room, desperately facing severe felony grand theft charges. She brilliantly planted a massive, entirely plausible seed of doubt, suggesting that the pathetic, cowardly brother was actively trading those detailed gambling ledgers to the local prosecutors right now in a desperate, pathetic attempt to secure a lighter prison sentence for himself. She painted the golden child not as a victim but as a dangerous, massive liability to their criminal enterprise. "If you harm me, you immediately trigger a massive federal manhunt," Clara warned with absolute brutal finality. She explicitly offered them a simple, undeniably logical choice. They could foolishly assault a protected federal witness and guarantee their entire organization would be violently raided by heavily armed government agents before midnight. Or, they could immediately leave the corporate premises, quickly clear out their illegal safe houses, and focus their violent, righteous anger entirely on the cowardly brother who had actively betrayed them to the police. She made it perfectly clear that she was absolutely not their target, but their incredibly dangerous, untouchable informant. The heavy, suffocating silence in the room stretched for several long, agonizing seconds as the gang leader rapidly processed the devastating information. He stared at the highly official federal documents, then looked deeply into Clara's cold, unflinching eyes. He instantly recognized the undeniable truth. She was significantly more dangerous and vastly more ruthless than the pathetic, whining brother who owed them the money. The leader slowly backed away from the polished mahogany desk, visibly fighting to forcefully swallow his arrogant pride in the face of overwhelming corporate and legal power. He sharply nodded to his two massive enforcers, silently signaling an immediate, tactical retreat from the highly dangerous situation. Before completely turning his back, he looked directly at Clara and offered a dark, violent promise regarding her brother's bleak future. He coldly swore that the cowardly golden child would not survive his first terrifying week inside the violent state penitentiary system, explicitly confirming that their brutal debt collection efforts would now be entirely focused on him inside the prison walls. The three dangerous men rapidly exited the executive office, their heavy footsteps quickly fading down the long, carpeted hallway. The heavy, wooden doors slowly swung shut, finally restoring the quiet, sterile atmosphere of the elite corporate law firm. Vance let out a long, heavy breath he had been unconsciously holding, visibly deeply impressed by Clara's incredibly cold, calculating performance under the threat of extreme physical violence. She had brilliantly weaponized the massive federal investigation, effortlessly turning the violent, dangerous predators completely against her toxic, manipulative brother. The golden child was now permanently trapped between the unforgiving criminal justice system and a highly motivated, incredibly violent underground syndicate. Clara smoothly closed her expensive laptop, her hands remaining perfectly steady without a single visible tremor of residual fear. She had completely severed the final, dangerous thread connecting her to her toxic family's catastrophic mistakes. But her ultimate, total victory required one final, absolutely vital strategic move to guarantee her permanent safety. She looked across the desk at her trusted litigation attorney, her expression hardening into absolute, unbreakable resolve. She explicitly instructed Vance to aggressively contact the local district attorney handling her brother's grand theft case. She demanded that Vance immediately submit the building's lobby security footage showing the armed gang members, officially using it to forcefully argue that her brother was an extreme flight risk and a massive danger to the community. She wanted his legal bail aggressively denied, permanently locking him inside the dangerous county jail where his violent creditors were already waiting. Just as Vance picked up his secure office phone to execute her ruthless command, Clara's personal smartphone vibrated with an incoming collect call directly originating from the local county correctional facility. The automated voice of the county correctional facility echoed coldly from the smartphone speaker, offering a prepaid collect call. Clara stared at the glowing screen for a long moment before pressing the green button to accept the incoming connection. The sterile, quiet atmosphere of the luxurious law office stood in stark contrast to the chaotic, terrifying background noise filtering through the digital audio connection. Heavy, frantic breathing immediately filled the line, followed by the high-pitched sobbing of a grown man who had finally realized his total powerlessness. Her younger brother sounded entirely broken, his usual entitled swagger completely erased by the harsh reality of a concrete holding cell. He choked on his panicked tears as he rapidly begged Clara to wire the massive cash bail required to secure his temporary freedom. He frantically whispered that dangerous, heavily tattooed inmates associated with his underground gambling creditors had already recognized him inside the crowded intake block. They had silently cornered him near the communal showers, promising to execute the gang leader's violent orders the exact second the guards looked away. He genuinely believed his wealthy sister was his absolute final lifeline to escape the terrifying situation. Clara did not interrupt his pathetic monologue. She let the heavy silence stretch across the digital line, forcing him to slowly absorb the freezing lack of any sisterly sympathy. When she finally spoke, her tone was devoid of any familial warmth. She informed him that she was actively doing the exact opposite of paying his expensive legal bail. She vividly recalled the countless holiday mornings where he had gleefully opened expensive presents secretly funded by her stolen academic future. She remembered his malicious laughter every time their parents had viciously criticized her grueling work ethic, falsely claiming she lacked his brilliant business talent. Clara weaponized those deeply painful memories, forging them into an impenetrable psychological shield against his current weeping. She coldly explained that her corporate attorney had officially submitted high-definition security footage of his violent gang associates to the district attorney. She brilliantly ensured the criminal court judge would officially label him a severe flight risk. "You are not leaving that facility," Clara stated with absolute clarity. "Your legal bail has been permanently denied based on my direct recommendation." The profound shock temporarily stopped his hysterical sobbing, leaving only a hollow, terrified silence on the other end of the line. He could not completely comprehend that the very sister he had ruthlessly mocked and financially drained his entire life was now the exact person intentionally locking the heavy steel cage around him. He desperately accused her of being a ruthless monster, wildly claiming she was intentionally sentencing him to a violent death inside the corrupt penal system. But his desperate anger quickly fractured into a new, incredibly pathetic layer of absolute despair. He rapidly confessed a sickening, fresh development that completely shattered his fragile understanding of their toxic family dynamic. He weeping revealed that their manipulative parents had just fiercely thrown him entirely under the massive federal bus to desperately save their own comfortable retirements. During the aggressive federal raid on their luxurious suburban estate, the terrified parents had immediately flipped their official story. They had explicitly lied to the heavily armed federal agents, aggressively claiming that the younger brother was the sole, evil mastermind behind the massive offshore money laundering syndicate. The mother had dramatically wept, falsely testifying that her precious son had violently manipulated his elderly, deeply confused parents into signing the illegal shell company documents. Marcus Vance quietly monitored the intense conversation through the secure desktop speakerphone, rapidly scribbling detailed legal notes on a yellow legal pad. He silently slid a handwritten note across the polished mahogany desk to Clara, explicitly confirming the legal reality of the situation. He wrote that aggressively blaming the youngest, most incompetent family member was a highly common, deeply cowardly defense strategy frequently utilized by cornered white-collar criminals, desperately facing lengthy federal prison sentences. The golden child had been violently sacrificed. The parents had spent their entire adult lives viciously enabling his terrible behavior, only to completely abandon him to the merciless federal prosecutors the exact second their own freedom was severely threatened. He desperately begged Clara to aggressively contact the federal authorities and officially clear his name regarding the massive international tax fraud, admitting he was entirely too stupid to coordinate such a complex international financial crime. She currently held the absolute key to his federal salvation right inside her encrypted legal files, perfectly capable of proving his complete ignorance regarding the complex offshore banking structures. However, Voluntarily handing over that specific exonerating evidence to the aggressive federal prosecutors would potentially complicate her own rock-solid immunity agreement and unnecessarily delay the severe prosecution of her toxic parents. Therefore, the absolute most efficient corporate solution was simply letting the foolish golden child silently absorb the catastrophic federal felony charges. They raised you to be completely unaccountable, and now you are successfully paying for their massive crimes, Clara replied smoothly, offering absolutely no legal salvation. She explicitly refused to provide the federal investigators with the exonerating forensic evidence, ruthlessly deciding to let the toxic family completely devour itself from the inside out. She told him to consider his impending, lengthy prison sentence as the final, massive bill coming due for his stolen luxury house and his stolen college education. A sudden, violent commotion erupted in the harsh background of the jail phone feed. Clara could clearly hear heavy, aggressive shouting, the terrifying sound of a violent physical scuffle, and the sharp, piercing blast of a correctional officer's emergency whistle. Her brother let out a short, terrified scream before the heavy plastic receiver slammed violently against a solid concrete wall. The automated correctional facility recording coldly announced that the prepaid call had been abruptly terminated by the facility administration due to an active security incident. Clara slowly lowered the expensive smartphone from her ear, staring blankly out the massive glass windows of the towering high-rise office building. The violent underground syndicate had apparently not wasted a single second in executing their dark, brutal promises. Before she could even process the violent end to the jailhouse conversation, the large flat television screen mounted in the corner office flashed with a massive breaking news alert. Her disgraced, desperate parents had somehow managed to post federal bail, and they were currently standing on the courthouse steps, aggressively surrounded by aggressive local reporters, preparing to deliver a highly publicized, deeply manipulative public statement directly targeting her. The high-definition television screen mounted in the luxurious corner office displayed a live breaking news broadcast from the federal courthouse steps. Clara watched with cold analytical detachment as her desperately cornered parents approached the heavy cluster of media microphones. Her mother was executing a highly theatrical performance, leaning heavily on the father's arm while wiping fabricated tears from her face with a delicate tissue. They had somehow temporarily secured their expensive federal bail, and their immediate instinct was to violently manipulate the highly volatile public narrative directly against her. The arrogant father leaned aggressively into the primary microphone, his voice dripping with completely fake sorrow. He blatantly lied directly to the flashing cameras, loudly claiming their traditional family had been ruthlessly victimized by a deeply disturbed, greedy daughter. He spun a wildly fabricated tale, asserting Clara had used her advanced technical skills as a senior software architect to illegally hack into their modest retirement accounts. He painted himself and his weeping wife as innocent, technologically illiterate victims of a brilliant, sociopathic mastermind completely devoid of any human empathy. The mother stepped forward, her voice dramatically trembling for maximum emotional impact. She falsely testified to the captive audience that Clara had violently framed her innocent younger brother out of deep-seated professional jealousy. She maliciously claimed Clara was using a highly expensive corporate attorney to illegally steal the family estate and forcefully silence her loving parents. The gathered reporters furiously scribbled notes, completely captivated by the sensational story of a wealthy tech executive brutally destroying her own elderly parents for sheer corporate greed. Marcus Vance stood perfectly still beside the polished mahogany desk, his sharp eyes narrowing as he analyzed the aggressive legal implications. He warned Clara this incredibly malicious public defamation was specifically designed to severely pressure her corporate employer. The toxic parents were intentionally trying to trigger a massive public relations scandal, desperately hoping her prestigious tech company would immediately fire her to avoid negative media attention. Without her massive corporate salary, she would lose her ability to fund the aggressive federal litigation. Clara did not display a single ounce of rising panic. She simply opened her expensive laptop, her fingers hovering over the illuminated keyboard with lethal precision. She explicitly refused to play their pathetic public relations game or issue a weak, defensive statement. Instead, she had spent the previous hour compiling a massive, heavily encrypted digital dossier containing the absolute forensic truth. The comprehensive file included the confirmed offshore bank routing numbers, the forged trust fund signatures, and the highly illegal Ponzi scheme ledgers. With a single, decisive keystroke, Clara executed a highly targeted digital distribution protocol. Using advanced data scraping techniques, she had actively acquired the direct, personal email addresses and private smartphone numbers of every single major journalist currently standing on those courthouse steps. She simultaneously transmitted the massive, undeniable forensic evidence packet directly into their pockets while her father was still aggressively lying on a live, daytime television broadcast without a single ounce of shame. The dramatic results were absolutely instantaneous. The chaotic live television broadcast captured the exact moment the narrative violently shifted. Dozens of smartphones began aggressively chiming and buzzing in absolute unison across the crowded courthouse steps. The reporters collectively looked down at their glowing screens, rapidly scanning the heavily redacted federal documents and the explicitly clear offshore banking transfers that completely contradicted the parents' weeping narrative. A prominent investigative journalist standing in the front row looked back up, his eyes suddenly burning with predatory professional curiosity. The seasoned reporter completely ignored the father's prepared monologue and aggressively shouted a devastating, highly specific question over the loud crowd. He loudly demanded to know why the father's personal, highly secure internet protocol address was directly linked to the massive Caribbean money laundering transfers if they were truly technologically illiterate victims. The father completely froze, his confident facade instantly shattering into countless tiny pieces on live broadcast. He nervously stammered, frantically looking around as the massive reality of his catastrophic public failure set in. Another aggressive reporter shoved a recording device forward, loudly asking the weeping mother to explicitly explain the massive Ponzi scheme they had ruthlessly operated against their own extended family members. The reporter explicitly cited the exact dollar amount stolen from the hysterical aunts and uncles, information cleanly provided in Clara's comprehensive digital leak. The mother gasped in pure horror, physically stumbling backward as the hostile media mob aggressively closed in, smelling the absolute destruction of their fake, suburban superiority. The parents desperately attempted to retreat, frantically pushing their way through the aggressive swarm of flashing cameras and shouting journalists. They violently demanded the press conference end immediately, completely abandoning their carefully rehearsed script in a desperate attempt to reach their waiting town car. Clara watched the spectacular, entirely self-inflicted public execution of their carefully curated social image from the absolute safety of the towering financial district. They were scrambling like terrified, cornered animals, completely humiliated, entirely defeated, and absolutely legally doomed by their own arrogant hubris. But the absolute worst consequence of their highly publicized broadcast was not the aggressive media. The live television camera rapidly panned to capture a chaotic, highly unexpected new development violently unfolding at the edge of the courthouse plaza. Several vehicles had aggressively jumped the concrete curb, and a massive, furious group of people was rapidly marching directly toward the retreating parents. It was the entire extended family, including the deeply hysterical aunt and the furious, financially ruined uncles who had just watched the treacherous broadcast. The furious flying monkeys were absolutely no longer attacking Clara. They physically charged the marble courthouse steps, violently screaming at the terrified parents and aggressively demanding the immediate return of their stolen retirement money. The massive scene instantly devolved into a violent, physical elderly riot right in front of the rolling news cameras. The shocked local police officers guarding the federal building had to violently intervene, physically dragging the screaming relatives away from the desperately cowering parents to prevent a severe physical assault. Inciting a massive public disturbance on federal property is an excellent legal reason to completely revoke their expensive bail, Marcus Vance noted with a cold, entirely ruthless corporate smile as he muted the chaotic television broadcast. He smoothly predicted the federal judge would rapidly throw them right back into a concrete holding cell. The toxic family was completely destroying itself precisely as Clara had engineered. Just as she leaned back in her comfortable leather chair, her secure corporate phone rang with a high-priority call from the chief executive officer of her tech company. Clara stared at the glowing screen of her secure corporate smartphone, watching the name of her billionaire chief executive officer flash with relentless urgency. She had just violently orchestrated a massive, highly public data leak that completely destroyed her parents on national television, creating a sensational media circus. The standard corporate protocol for any senior employee involved in such a massive, chaotic public scandal was an immediate, quiet termination to protect the company's prestigious brand. She took a slow, highly controlled breath, completely preparing herself to ruthlessly negotiate a massive severance package, and smoothly accepted the high-priority incoming call. The deep, authoritative voice of the chief executive officer echoed through the quiet executive office, completely devoid of any standard corporate pleasantries. He explicitly informed Clara that the entire executive board had just watched her violently dismantle her toxic family's fake public relations narrative live on the major news networks. He coldly noted the incredibly sophisticated data scraping techniques she had utilized to instantaneously distribute the heavily encrypted financial evidence to the aggressive media swarm. He did not sound angry, panicked, or concerned about the massive public spectacle she had brought to their corporate doorstep. Instead, the powerful billionaire sounded profoundly impressed by her absolute, cold-blooded tactical brilliance under extreme emotional pressure. He explicitly stated that the prestigious technology firm did not want weak, easily manipulated executives who cowered during a massive crisis or allowed themselves to be publicly victimized. He completely bypassed any discussion of termination, abruptly offering her an immediate, massive promotion to the highly coveted position of Chief Technology Officer. He aggressively demanded that she apply that exact same ruthless, uncompromising precision to actively protect the corporation's massive digital infrastructure and highly secure global data protocols. Clara did not hesitate, express any pathetic gratitude, or display any emotional shock at the massive, unexpected career elevation. She calmly accepted the powerful executive position, immediately demanding a massive increase in her corporate equity shares and a completely unrestricted budget for her new security division. The chief executive officer chuckled darkly, thoroughly appreciating her aggressive corporate negotiation tactics, and formally agreed to all her uncompromising terms before abruptly ending the call. Clara smoothly lowered the phone, her independent financial empire now permanently secured and vastly expanded far beyond her original expectations. Marcus Vance watched the entire exchange from across the polished mahogany desk, a rare, genuinely respectful smile appearing on his usually stern face. He explicitly acknowledged that her brilliant, ruthless corporate maneuver had completely eliminated the toxic parent's final, desperate strategy to financially ruin her. With her massive new corporate salary and powerful executive resources fully secured, they could rapidly accelerate the absolute destruction of the parent's remaining assets. Vance smoothly opened his laptop, directly accessing the highly restricted federal court database to verify the immediate fallout from the violent courthouse riot. The aggressive legal results were exactly as devastating as the seasoned litigation attorney had predicted just minutes prior. The presiding federal judge was absolutely furious that the toxic parents had intentionally incited a massive, violent public disturbance on highly secure government property while out on federal bail. The judge had immediately signed a sweeping emergency order, officially revoking their temporary freedom and aggressively commanding the federal marshals to violently drag them back into custody. The arrogant father and the weeping mother were currently sitting in separate, cold concrete holding cells, completely stripped of their expensive designer clothes. Vance aggressively capitalized on their sudden, complete loss of physical freedom by immediately executing the final, devastating financial blow against their fake suburban empire. He officially filed the massive, comprehensive lien against their primary residential estate, completely freezing their ability to legally sell the property or borrow against its remaining equity. Because the parents had foolishly leveraged multiple high-interest mortgages to secretly fund the younger brother's reckless gambling addiction, the massive suburban house was already dangerously close to total financial collapse. Vance ruthlessly initiated a highly aggressive, expedited foreclosure process with the primary banking institution. Within 2 short hours, a specialized legal team representing the massive national bank physically arrived at the parents' completely abandoned suburban property. They aggressively carried heavy steel chains and massive industrial padlocks, completely securing the large iron gates and officially seizing the massive estate on behalf of the corporate creditors. They brutally pounded bright neon eviction notices and highly visible foreclosure documents directly onto the expensive custom wooden front door for all the gossiping neighborhood residents to clearly see. The parents' entire fabricated legacy of absolute superiority had been officially repossessed and completely erased from the prestigious community. Clara stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the elite law firm, looking out over the sprawling, beautiful city skyline with a profound sense of absolute closure. She had successfully transformed decades of quiet, invisible emotional abuse into a highly public, completely undeniable legal execution that left her toxic abusers with absolutely nothing. Her parents had intentionally sacrificed her college education, her financial security, and her emotional well-being just to desperately maintain a fake, wealthy illusion. Now, that pathetic illusion was completely shattered, leaving them facing decades of mandatory federal prison time with absolutely zero financial resources to defend themselves. Just as Clara prepared to leave the secure law office and return to her new, highly powerful corporate position, Vance's private administrative assistant knocked urgently on the heavy wooden door. She quickly entered the quiet room, carrying a highly official, heavily sealed legal document that had just been aggressively delivered by a federal courier. The exhausted, completely defeated parents had officially waived their right to a lengthy, expensive federal trial, desperately begging for a formal plea agreement to slightly reduce their massive prison sentences. But the aggressive federal prosecutors required one final, absolute condition before finalizing the legal paperwork. The lead federal prosecutor explicitly demanded that Clara, as the primary financial victim of their massive offshore money laundering syndicate, physically attend the final, formal plea hearing. The toxic parents were legally forced to stand directly in front of the federal judge and publicly confess every single horrific detail of their massive crimes while looking directly into their daughter's eyes. They were completely desperate to quickly sign the binding plea agreement before the violent underground syndicate could successfully reach their precious cowardly son inside the dangerous county jail. "Tell the federal prosecutor I will absolutely attend," Clara commanded coldly. The heavy oak doors of the grand federal courtroom swung open, revealing a cavernous space dominated by rich mahogany and intimidating judicial authority. Clara walked down the center aisle with perfectly measured, incredibly confident steps. She wore a stunning, impeccably tailored designer suit that radiated absolute corporate power and unbothered wealth. Marcus Vance walked silently beside her, carrying a slim leather briefcase containing the final, devastating legal documents. They took their seats in the front row, explicitly reserved for the primary victims of severe federal financial crimes. The gallery behind them was completely packed with furious, aggressively muttering extended family members who had also been ruthlessly defrauded by the massive familial Ponzi scheme. A heavy, terrifying silence abruptly fell over the crowded room as the side doors violently clicked open. Two heavily armed federal marshals aggressively escorted her parents into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the judicial chamber. The arrogant, wealthy facade they had desperately maintained for their entire adult lives was completely and permanently erased. They were forcefully wearing oversized, brightly colored prison uniforms, their wrists and ankles heavily bound by thick steel chains that rattled loudly with every slow, defeated step. The father, once a violently imposing bully, looked incredibly small and physically hollowed out by the terrifying reality of a cold concrete cell. The mother, who had spent decades obsessing over her pristine suburban image and expensive country club memberships, was completely unrecognizable. Her hair was heavily matted, her face pale and deeply lined with sheer, undeniable terror. They were aggressively guided to the defense table, completely surrounded by exhausted public defenders who clearly despised their arrogant clients. When the parents finally dared to look across the wide aisle, their desperate eyes instantly locked onto Clara. They silently pleaded for a tiny, miraculous ounce of filial mercy, desperately hoping the successful daughter would suddenly stand up and stop the massive legal execution. Clara did not blink, completely refusing to offer even a fraction of a sympathetic expression. She sat perfectly still, her face carved from solid, freezing ice. The presiding federal judge, a stern man with absolutely zero tolerance for wealthy white-collar criminals, aggressively struck his heavy wooden gavel. He commanded the silent courtroom, explicitly demanding that the primary defendants stand and verbally confirm the binding terms of their massive federal plea agreement. The judge coldly instructed the broken father to read his highly detailed, legally binding confession completely out loud, directly onto the permanent public record. The father's hands violently trembled as he picked up the heavy stack of legal papers. His voice, previously used exclusively to loudly bark arrogant commands and hurl vicious insults at Clara, was now a pathetic, broken whisper. The stern judge aggressively ordered him to speak directly into the microphone. The father choked back a heavy sob as he formally admitted to systematically draining his own daughter's protected college trust fund. He explicitly confessed to committing severe wire fraud and maliciously crossing state lines with stolen institutional money just to blindly fund his lazy, incompetent son's luxurious lifestyle. The massive humiliation deepened as the mother was forcefully ordered to stand and publicly address her own horrific crimes. She violently wept as she read her formal confession, officially admitting she had maliciously stolen Clara's private social security number to illegally establish fraudulent offshore shell companies. She explicitly confessed to aggressively operating a massive, highly illegal Ponzi scheme that completely destroyed the retirement savings of her own trusting siblings. The furious gasps and aggressive, hateful muttering from the crowded gallery behind Clara violently confirmed the absolute destruction of the mother's entire social existence. The federal judge leaned far over his elevated mahogany bench, his dark eyes burning with profound, righteous disgust. He explicitly noted that in his entire, lengthy judicial career, he had rarely witnessed such a sickening, calculating betrayal of basic parental duty. He aggressively demanded that both parents turn around and look directly at the primary victim of their massive financial terrorism. The heavy steel chains rattled loudly as the completely broken couple slowly turned to face the incredibly successful, vastly wealthy daughter they had violently abused and intentionally discarded for decades. "Do you have anything to say to the victim before this court imposes the mandatory maximum sentence?" the judge demanded coldly. The father violently dropped to his knees, his heavy steel chains crashing against the polished hardwood floor. He wildly begged Clara for forgiveness, loudly weeping that he was completely terrified of dying inside a violent federal penitentiary. The mother aggressively joined him, hysterically pleading that they were still her loving family, desperately begging the wealthy tech executive to somehow use her massive corporate influence to completely reverse the devastating federal charges. Clara slowly stood up, looking down at the pathetic, weeping strangers kneeling helplessly on the courtroom floor. She vividly remembered the cold, terrifying night they had violently blocked the front door of their expensive house, aggressively demanding she surrender her hard-earned luxury vehicle to cover the golden child's gambling debts. She looked directly into their desperate, pleading eyes and delivered her final, devastating verdict without a single ounce of hesitation. "You are absolutely nothing to me," Clara stated with a cold, terrifyingly calm precision that perfectly echoed throughout the massive, silent courtroom. She smoothly turned her back on their hysterical, piercing screams and confidently walked straight down the center aisle. She completely ignored the frantic, desperate begging echoing loudly behind her, her expensive designer heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. Marcus Vance immediately followed, offering a brief, highly respectful nod to the stern federal judge before the heavy oak doors smoothly closed behind them. The judge aggressively struck his heavy gavel, officially sentencing the weeping couple to decades of mandatory federal incarceration with absolutely zero possibility of early parole. Simultaneously, miles away in the violent county jail, the younger brother was currently sitting in a dark, terrifying isolation cell. He was completely trapped, stripped of his golden child status, and desperately waiting for the violent underground syndicate to eventually bypass the bribed correctional guards. The entire toxic bloodline had been completely systematically neutralized by their own arrogant greed and Clara's absolute, uncompromising brilliance. Clara stepped out into the incredibly bright, beautiful afternoon sunlight cascading across the sweeping federal plaza. She smoothly unlocked her brand-new, highly expensive electric vehicle, the precise, luxurious machine that had inadvertently triggered the complete destruction of her toxic family on her birthday. She slid into the premium leather seat, perfectly adjusting the climate controls before smoothly pulling out into the chaotic, vibrant city traffic. As the newly appointed chief technology officer of a massive, globally dominating corporation, she had an incredibly busy, deeply fulfilling afternoon schedule. She was absolutely not going to waste another single, valuable second thinking about the pathetic criminals she had permanently left behind in the dark.